I never thought much about the old town we lived in. It was a quiet place, the kind where nothing ever seemed to happen, where everyone knew everyone's business. The kind of place where you could walk down the street without locking your door and nobody would think twice about leaving their front porch light on all night. But all that changed the day we found the bunker. It all started when my friend Derek called me one evening asking if I wanted to help him out with something strange he had found. Derek worked as a mechanic and spent a lot of time fixing up old cars and trucks in the garage behind his house. That evening, while he was digging around some abandoned properties just outside of town, he discovered something odd, an entrance to an underground bunker. When I first heard him on the phone, I figured it was just another one of his wild ideas. Derek had always been a bit of a troublemaker, poking around in places he shouldn't and getting himself into situations he couldn't always get out of. But the urgency in his voice was different this time, and something about it made my blood run cold. "Nick, you've got to see this. It's not just an old cellar or storage. I don't know what it is, man, but it's something else." He paused, then added, "I don't want to go down there alone. There's something weird about it." I wasn't sure what to think, but I agreed to meet him. After all, Derek was my best friend, and if he was really that freaked out, I knew it had to be something unusual. I arrived at his house just as the sun was setting, casting a dull orange glow over everything. Derek was standing by his truck, looking pale and nervous. His hands were shaking, and I could see beads of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. "Ready?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded, trying to mask my own anxiety. We didn't say much as we walked toward the woods behind his house. The spot he'd found was just past the old creek that ran through town, in an area that hadn't seen much human traffic for years. It was an overgrown patch of land, dense with trees and thick with vines. But there, hidden beneath a tangle of roots and moss, was something that shouldn't have been there. A steel door. It wasn't the kind of door you'd expect to find in the woods. It was heavy, industrial, designed to withstand whatever it was that lay behind it. Derek had pried it open earlier, and as he led me closer, I could see the faint outline of the entrance, a small rusted handle on the side. My heart pounded. Something about that door, something about the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, made me feel like we were about to disturb something that had been buried for a long time. I didn't want to go any further. But Derek had already opened it, and he was looking at me with wide eyes, silently urging me to follow him. "After you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked forward, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. The darkness beyond the threshold felt suffocating. It was as if the air itself had grown thick with a strange, oppressive weight. I glanced back at Derek, but he was already stepping inside, flashlight in hand, casting long, eerie shadows across the narrow hallway that led deeper into the earth. We descended the stairs carefully, each step echoing in the silence. I could feel the temperature drop as we went further down, and by the time we reached the bottom, I was shivering. The walls of the bunker were lined with concrete, old wiring hanging from the ceiling like spider webs. It smelled musty, as though no one had been down there in decades. "Look at this," Derek said, his voice trembling. He pointed to a set of metal doors at the far end of the room. The words, "Top Secret," were stamped across them in bold, faded red letters. My blood ran cold. What kind of place was this? Why was it buried out here, hidden away from the rest of the world? I felt a rush of unease, but Derek was already moving toward the doors, pulling out a crowbar from his bag to force them open. The metal scraped loudly, and the doors finally gave way with a sharp screech. The room inside was dark, save for the faint glow of his flashlight. There, in the center of the room, was a desk. Papers were scattered across it, old, yellowing files that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. There was a stack of books, a few open, their pages curling at the edges. But the thing that caught my attention was the machine. It was a large, old-fashioned computer, the kind that looked like something out of a 1960s sci-fi movie. The monitor flickered with static, but the strange thing was, it wasn't just the screen that was lit up. There were faint, glowing symbols on the walls around us, symbols I didn't recognize, as if they were some sort of language or code. I stepped closer to the desk, my hand trembling as I reached for one of the papers. It looked like some sort of research, notes on experiments, dates, and strange references to something called Project Phoenix. Project Phoenix? I muttered, my voice breaking the heavy silence. Derek didn't answer. Instead, he was staring at the screen, his eyes wide with fear. Nick, you need to see this, he said, his voice shaky. I turned to look at the monitor. The static cleared for a moment, and in its place, I saw a picture, a blurry image of something I couldn't quite make out. It was dark, distorted, but it looked like a room much like the one we were in. But this wasn't an ordinary room. There was something in it, something moving. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the image disappeared, leaving only the static behind. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What the hell was that? I don't know, Derek whispered, stepping back from the screen, but I think we've disturbed something we weren't supposed to. Before I could respond, the lights in the bunker flickered. The air grew even colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the walls. It was like the bunker was alive, the ground beneath us trembling as if something deep below was waking up. I turned to look at Derek, but he wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I spun around, calling his name, but there was no answer. The room was empty. I was alone. A shadow flickered across the wall, and I froze. Something was there, just out of sight. My heart raced as I turned, but there was no one. Only the creeping darkness and the faint glow of the monitor. Then, from somewhere deep in the bowels of the bunker, I heard it. A voice, low and almost inaudible. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking to someone or something else. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the whispers. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. What had Derek found? What had we stumbled into? Then the whisper stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Absolute silence. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for any sign of Derek. But the only thing I saw was the door, the steel door we had entered through. It was slowly closing, as though it was being drawn shut by an invisible force. I ran toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it, trapping me inside. The last thing I remember is the sudden rush of cold air, the flickering lights, and that terrible, low whisper. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back outside the bunker. The door was closed, and the woods around me were still and silent. But Derek was gone. I haven't been back to that place since. I don't know what happened to Derek. I don't know what we found down there. But I know this much. Some things are better left buried. If you ever find yourself in a small town like mine, and you come across a hidden bunker in the woods, turn around. Don't go inside, because whatever is down there, it's not meant to be found.
Next story.
It was a summer afternoon, the kind where the air hangs thick with heat and the scent of freshly cut grass drifts through the open windows. Small town America. I never thought something so sinister could happen here, in this sleepy little town where nothing exciting ever really happened. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest news was whether the bakery would sell out of pies by noon. It all started when a group of us, my friends and me, decided to explore an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I don't know why we did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the stories the older folks used to whisper about the house when they thought we weren't listening. There were rumors that it had been home to a family who vanished overnight, leaving everything behind. Some said it was a murder-suicide. Others claimed it was a cult, and some even said it was haunted. On that particular afternoon, we weren't thinking about ghosts. We were just bored kids looking for something to do. We climbed over the rusted gate, the hinges creaking like an old man's bones. The house was a wreck, the front porch sagging under years of neglect. We pushed through the broken door, which was barely hanging on by a hinge, and stepped inside. Dust swirled in the air as the sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting eerie shadows on the rotting wooden floors. But we didn't find anything remarkable, not at first. Just peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and the smell of decay. It wasn't until we made our way down into the basement that things took a turn. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step a warning. When we reached the bottom, we found something we weren't expecting. A hidden door in the back of the basement. It wasn't much to look at, just an old wooden door with rusted hinges, barely noticeable behind a pile of discarded boxes and old furniture. I remember how my heart raced as I approached it, my fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. My friends dared me to open it, and I couldn't resist. I pulled the door open, revealing a narrow, stone stairwell that seemed to descend forever into darkness. It was cold down there, colder than it should have been. It didn't feel like the kind of cold you'd get from an old house. It felt wrong. Without thinking, I led the way down, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The stairs creaked and groaned under our feet, each step deeper into the unknown. When we reached the bottom, we were standing in what appeared to be a concrete tunnel. The air was damp and musty, and the walls were covered in mildew and grime. The tunnel stretched out before us, disappearing into more darkness. The sound of our breathing seemed to echo off the walls, making everything feel more claustrophobic. It was then that I noticed something strange. There were symbols scrawled on the walls, faint and barely visible in the dim light. They looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Ancient, cryptic, almost as if they had been drawn in haste, perhaps by someone who was running out of time. My friends noticed them too, and I could see the unease in their eyes. But curiosity kept us moving forward. We didn't know how far we'd walked when we finally saw it, a door at the end of the tunnel just barely ajar. The door looked newer than anything else down there, almost out of place. I don't know why we didn't turn back. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was just sheer stupidity. But we pushed the door open, and what we saw beyond it made my stomach turn. The room inside was like nothing I'd ever encountered. It was a bunker, a small fortified underground structure. But what was most disturbing was the atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of stale old air and something metallic. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rows upon rows of small glass vials filled with strange dark liquids. There were also papers, so many papers, strewn across tables and countertops. Some were handwritten in neat, meticulous handwriting. Others were hastily scrawled in a way that made the words nearly illegible. But it wasn't the vials or papers that made my blood run cold. It was the thing that stood in the center of the room, a large steel contraption, something like an old makeshift altar. There were strange marks on the floor, circles drawn in what looked like old blood. And in the center of the altar was a book, a thick, leather-bound book, so ancient-looking that it seemed to exude a presence of its own. My friend Jake was the first to approach it. He seemed drawn to it, his eyes wide with fascination and fear, and before anyone could stop him, he reached for it. As soon as his fingers touched the cover, there was a low hum, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls. It was like the whole bunker was coming alive. My heart raced, and I stepped back, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. Something wasn't right. It felt like we had just awakened something that had been asleep for far too long. I remember the look on Jake's face when he opened the book. His eyes widened in terror, and his hand trembled. The words inside were in some kind of language none of us recognized. Twisted, unreadable symbols that seemed to writhe on the page, shifting and changing like they were alive. And then the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. This was something else. The entire bunker rattled, and the walls seemed to groan as if they were struggling to hold themselves together. There was a loud bang, followed by the sound of something scraping against the concrete. The shelves rattled, the vials shaking in their glass containers. It felt like the bunker itself was waking up, like it had been dormant for decades, waiting for someone to disturb it. And that's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the tunnel. At first, we thought it was just our imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer. There was something else too, something more unnerving, a low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. We turned, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, pale, and gaunt, emerged from the shadows at the end of the tunnel. It was dragging something behind it, something large and heavy. Its eyes glowed, an unnatural, sickly yellow, and it seemed to float just above the ground, its feet never quite touching the floor. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and bolted, the others right behind me. The sound of footsteps chasing us echoed through the tunnel as we scrambled back toward the stairs. But I could hear the thing moving closer, its growl growing louder and more frantic. We didn't stop until we burst out of the basement and into the light, panting and trembling with fear. We didn't speak as we ran all the way back to town. We didn't even stop to look back, but I knew that thing was following us, that it was still out there, lurking in the dark. I haven't been back to that house since that day, and I never will. Some say the thing in the bunker was a ghost, but I don't think it was. It felt too real. It was as if it had been waiting for us, for someone to disturb it. And I don't know if it's still down there, waiting, but I can't shake the feeling that it is. I've been haunted ever since, haunted by the things I saw down there and by the thing that followed us. It never leaves my mind. Every night, I can hear the scratching of something against the walls, like nails on concrete, and I hear that growl, low and rumbling, echoing from somewhere just beyond my reach. Small-town America isn't what it seems. You think you know your neighbors, your streets, the houses you walk by every day, but sometimes there's something beneath it all, something buried so deep that it waits for years, decades, until someone stumbles upon it, and then it awakens.
Next story.
It started like any other day in our small town of Hollow Creek, a place where everyone knew everyone else. No one ever locked their doors, and the only thing that kept us apart were the miles of farmland and wooded areas that surrounded the town. People didn't get lost here. Everyone felt safe, and life went on at a slow, predictable pace. But all of that changed the day they found the bunker. I remember it so clearly, even now. It was just a normal afternoon when I heard the knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before answering. When I opened it, I was greeted by Sheriff Daniels, his face grim and his eyes darting nervously. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. "Sure, Sheriff. What's going on?" He stepped inside, looking over his shoulder before closing the door behind him. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice low. "Something strange has turned up in the woods just north of here. Something we weren't expecting." I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't say anything. I waited for him to continue. "They found a hidden bunker," he said finally, his eyes locking with mine. "Old, abandoned, but it's not like anything we've seen before." He didn't explain much else, just told me to stay inside and keep my doors locked. I couldn't understand what he was getting at, but I knew better than to question him. Sheriff Daniels had been with the force for nearly 20 years, and if he was nervous, then we all had a reason to be. That night, the air was thick with unease. People whispered in the streets, and rumors began to spread. Some said the bunker had been there for decades, possibly since the Cold War. Others thought it was some kind of government facility that had been abandoned when the town was established. But none of it made sense. Hollow Creek was too small to have ever warranted something like that. I didn't get much sleep that night. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. The town seemed off, somehow, as if something was watching, waiting. But I couldn't put my finger on it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of sirens. It wasn't unusual to hear them in town, but today it was different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a sense of something wrong. I got up and dressed quickly, my mind racing. Whatever they'd found in the bunker had shaken the sheriff, and that was enough to make me worry. When I reached the town square, I saw a crowd gathered. Sheriff Daniels was standing in front of a large van, talking to a few men in dark suits. They weren't from around here. I had seen them around, but they weren't locals. They looked out of place, their eyes scanning everyone as if they were looking for something. I approached the sheriff, but before I could ask what was going on, he held up a hand to stop me. His face was pale, his expression tight with tension. "Get back to your house now," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is bigger than anything we've dealt with before." I didn't argue. I knew better than to press him when he was like this. As I turned to leave, I heard one of the strangers behind me speak, his voice cold and deliberate. "Lock everything down. No one leaves town." That was when the fear truly hit me. There was something wrong, terribly wrong. I returned home, but sleep didn't come. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The wind whistled through the trees like some kind of ominous warning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking just outside. That afternoon, a group of us gathered at the diner to talk. We were all on edge, looking for answers. Word had spread fast, and everyone wanted to know what was going on. "Have you heard the latest?" Frank, the owner of the local gas station, asked. They're saying there's something alive in that bunker. Alive, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Frank lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. I overheard one of those men in the suits. He said it wasn't just abandoned, it was sealed for a reason, like something inside it was waiting. I felt my stomach churn. The idea of something waiting in that bunker didn't sit right with me. But the worst part was, none of us knew what it was. That night, things got even worse. As I sat in my living room, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the window, but no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, scanning the yard. Nothing. I stepped outside, confused, when I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper from the woods. Help? I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The voice sounded distant, almost otherworldly, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice I didn't recognize, and yet it sounded familiar. I stepped forward, drawn to the sound. I don't know why, but something about it felt like it was calling me. As I walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking and groaning like old bones. The whispering grew louder. Help! Help me! I moved faster, my breath coming in short gasps until I stumbled upon something I wasn't prepared for. The bunker. It wasn't hidden as well as I thought. The door, rusty and covered in moss, stood slightly ajar. A faint, sickly light flickered from within, casting shadows across the ground. My legs trembled as I approached, but I couldn't stop myself. The whisper was too strong, too persistent. I pushed the door open, and the air inside was thick with a strange metallic smell. It felt like the place hadn't been opened in years, and yet the light still flickered. Something was alive in here, and it wasn't human. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, trying to make sense of the room. There were old crates and scattered papers, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the walls. They were covered in symbols. Strange, jagged symbols that I didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse almost as if they were alive, like they were watching me. As I stared at them, my skin prickled with a cold sweat. I felt something shift in the air, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadows. Its shape was indistinct, like smoke or mist, something undeniably wrong about it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a faint red light, and as it stared at me, I felt a wave of terror crash over me. It spoke, its voice like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. You shouldn't have come here. I froze, my blood running cold. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was made of shadows and nightmares. Leave now, it whispered again, its voice echoing in my head. But it was too late. I couldn't escape. The walls closed in around me, and the last thing I remember was the sound of laughter, a low, haunting laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bed. I don't know how I got there. I don't know if what I saw was real or just a nightmare, but I'm certain of one thing. The bunker isn't empty. And whatever is in there, whatever it is that has been waiting, it's still there. I haven't told anyone the full story. I can't. People would think I was crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever is inside that bunker has found a way to reach out. The sheriff knows too. He's gone quiet, avoiding everyone. I haven't seen those men in dark suits again, but I can feel them watching, waiting. Hollow Creek will never be the same.
Next story.
It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Pine Hollow, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural America. The sort of place where life moved at its own slow pace, where neighbors waved from their porches and everyone knew everyone else's business. But that all changed the day we found the bunker. It was me, Lisa, my older brother Jake, and our friend Chris. We'd been inseparable since childhood, always out exploring the woods or riding our bikes down to the old mill. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary on this particular day, but that was the first mistake we made. The day started like any other. Jake had been raving about a new spot he had found while hiking the day before, some old remnants of a forgotten part of town. He'd promised us that it was going to be something interesting, maybe an abandoned house or an old shed. It wasn't. We hiked through the dense forest just past the outskirts of town, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels. Chris cracked jokes, trying to keep things light, but I could tell by the look on Jake's face that something was different this time. He was excited, but there was a nervous edge to it. "You okay?" I asked him, my voice catching in the stillness of the woods. Jake shot me a look, eyes wide with that look he always had when he found something truly fascinating. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. "But this is gonna blow your mind. Just wait." We trekked deeper into the woods, the path narrowing as the trees grew thicker. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was swallowing us whole. I could feel the tension building as we walked. Something didn't feel right. That's when we saw it. It was hidden behind a tangle of vines, an overgrown, rusted metal door that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was just sitting there, as if someone had decided to bury it away, hiding it from the world. "What is that?" Chris asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer right away. He was staring at the door, his face pale. I could see his chest rising and falling, his breathing picking up. For a moment, I thought he might turn and run. Then he reached out and grabbed the door handle. "It's a bunker," Jake said, voice shaking. "It's got to be, but why would someone hide it here?" I didn't know what to say. I'd heard stories of secret military bunkers or underground shelters, but this didn't feel like one of those. It felt wrong. Before I could say anything, Jake pulled the door open with a loud groan. We stepped inside and the temperature dropped immediately. It was like walking into a tomb, the air heavy with dust and decay. The darkness swallowed us whole, and I could barely make out the shapes of the walls and ceiling. I wasn't sure if it was the chill or the sense of dread creeping up my spine, but something felt off. We shouldn't have been there. "This is crazy," Chris muttered, pulling out his phone to use the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the immediate area, but it wasn't much. The walls were concrete, rough and jagged in places. There were old, broken-down tables scattered around, covered in cobwebs. Strange markings were carved into the walls, some of them in languages I didn't recognize. As we moved deeper into the bunker, the silence was almost suffocating. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then we heard it. A sound. Soft at first, like the faint rustle of something moving in the shadows. It wasn't just the wind or the creaking of the old structure. It was something else. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "What was that?" I whispered. Jake didn't answer. His eyes were darting around, searching the darkness. "I don't know," he said, voice tight. "Let's keep going." We moved cautiously, step by step, deeper into the bunker. The air felt thicker now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. The deeper we went, the more the walls seemed to close in on us, as though the bunker itself was alive and constricting. We came to a large room, its walls covered in faded symbols and strange drawings. There were old monitors, some of them flickering with static. The eerie hum of the machines filled the room, sending chills down my spine. Jake approached one of the monitors, brushing off the dust. The screen flickered for a moment before it came to life. A grainy, black and white image filled the screen. A man in military garb, sitting at a desk, looking directly at the camera. But it wasn't just any man. His eyes were vacant, his face gaunt and pale. The expression was unnerving, like he was staring into something beyond the screen. Something dark. "What the hell?" Chris whispered. Before we could react, the image shifted. It wasn't just a man on the screen anymore. It was a room, a dimly lit room with shadows moving in the corners. And in that room, there was something else. Something. Watching. I could feel my heart race. It was like the walls themselves were closing in, the air growing colder by the second. "Get out," the voice on the monitor said suddenly, breaking the silence. It was low, hoarse, as if the man had been speaking for a long time. "Get out now. It's awake. You shouldn't have come here." The screen flickered again, then went black. The room was plunged into darkness once more. I don't know why we stayed. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the curiosity, or just the sheer need to understand what was going on. But something inside me told me that the bunker wasn't just a forgotten shelter. It was a prison for something far worse than we could imagine. "Let's go," Jake said, suddenly sounding shaken. "Now." But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. Panic set in. I tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut, something that didn't want us to leave. Then, from the shadows, we heard a low, guttural growl. It came from the corner of the room, from the darkened hallway we hadn't yet explored. I didn't want to look, but something made me turn. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. And then it moved. We ran. I don't remember much after that. Only the sound of our footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floors, the frantic pull of the door as we finally managed to escape. We burst out into the daylight, gasping for breath, but when we turned to look back, there was no bunker. It was gone, as if it had never existed. We never spoke of that day again. Not to anyone, not even to each other. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear it. The whispering, the growl. And I know deep down that whatever we stumbled upon that day, it's still down there, waiting.
Next story.
I've always believed in the supernatural. Growing up, I had a mother who would tell me ghost stories before bed, all about restless spirits and strange happenings. But nothing could have prepared me for the night that changed everything. The night I encountered something I had only heard of in those stories. It was a cold evening in October when it all began. My name is Natalie, and I had recently moved to the small town of Blackwood Hills. It wasn't much, but it was close enough to the city for work and far enough for some peace and quiet. The kind of place where everyone knows each other and things didn't seem to change much year to year. My new apartment was an old building, one that had once been a grand home but was now divided into several units. The halls were narrow, the floors creaked with every step, and the staircase wound its way up like something from a Victorian ghost story. The landlord, Mrs. Evans, was a sweet old woman with a permanent smile, but her eyes seemed to flicker with a knowledge of something I couldn't quite understand. She mentioned that I'd be the third tenant in the building this year. The previous two had left unexpectedly, though she didn't say why. I didn't think much of it. The place was cheap and convenient, and it didn't seem like the kind of place where anything strange could happen. At least, not until the first night I spent there. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, got used to the creaky floors, and settled into my routine. It wasn't until the fourth night that I first heard it. A soft tapping noise, almost like the sound of fingernails on wood. It started faintly at first, but as the hours passed, it grew louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the building settling. But by midnight, the tapping had turned into something far more disturbing. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside my door. I crept to the door, heart racing, and listened. Nothing. The hall was silent. Shaking off the unease, I went back to bed, convinced it was just my imagination. But over the next few nights, the tapping continued. Sometimes it was faint, other times it was so loud that it kept me awake for hours. I began to dread the nights, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The weirdest part? It always started at exactly midnight. One evening, after a long day at work, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone, I stepped out into the hallway. The air was heavy, and the house felt oddly cold, even though the heating was on. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet as I approached the source of the sound. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door at the end of the hall, the one that led to an old storage room, was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to stand out, like it was beckoning me. The tapping was louder now, almost frantic, coming from inside that room. My hands were shaking, but I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the air thick with dust. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the room itself. It was the figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, its back hunched, and its face was obscured by shadows. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural breathing. I froze. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A voice, low and rasping. "Leave this place." I stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from my hands. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty. save for the piles of forgotten junk. I didn't wait another second. I ran back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination, maybe brought on by exhaustion or stress. But the tapping continued. It became a regular occurrence every night at midnight. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was always there. And sometimes I could swear that the tapping was closer, like it was moving around the apartment, circling my door. The worst part was the nights when it stopped altogether. I'd wake up to silence, and then I would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps walking down the hallway, coming closer and closer to my door. But when I looked outside, no one was there. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. One afternoon, I went to visit Mrs. Evans. I asked her about the building's history, about the tenants who had left, about anything she knew. At first, she hesitated, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read. Then, finally, she spoke. "There's something in that building," she said quietly. "I didn't want to tell you, but I see how much you're struggling. The last tenants, they didn't leave on their own. They were driven out." "Driven out by what?" I pressed. Mrs. Evans sighed. "A long time ago, a man lived in that building. His name was Thomas, and he was, well, let's just say he wasn't a good man. He practiced things that shouldn't be practiced, and when he died, something stayed behind. A part of him, or maybe something worse. The tapping you hear, it's him. The footsteps, it's him. And every tenant who has lived there has heard it, or worse." I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to say it was just a story, just some old superstition. But I couldn't deny what I had experienced. And the thought that this Thomas, or whatever had been left behind, was still there, it was enough to make my skin crawl. That night, I decided to confront it. I didn't want to run anymore. I was determined to get to the bottom of this. At midnight, I stood at the end of the hallway, staring at the storage room door. The tapping had already started, louder than ever. It was almost as if it was calling me, inviting me to open the door, to face whatever was waiting inside. I took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob. The moment I opened the door, the temperature dropped. The room was pitch black, but I could feel something in the air, something that wasn't right. I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. The tapping resumed, faster now, like a countdown. And then, the voice. "Leave this place." I felt it, something cold and vile, creeping up behind me. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, red and angry, staring at me from the far corner of the room. I ran. I don't know how, but I managed to find the strength to open the door and get back into the hallway. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. I didn't dare look back. I left that night, packing what I could and fleeing without a second thought. I never went back to that apartment, and I don't know if anyone ever did. But sometimes when I walk through Blackwood Hills, I still hear it, the faint tapping in the distance, calling me back to that cursed place.
Next story.
It was late September when it all started. The leaves had begun to change color, and the air had that crisp autumn bite. For most people, it was just another season in the small town of Maple Creek. But for me, it was the beginning of a nightmare. My name's Sam, and I was raised in Maple Creek. It's one of those picturesque little towns with the kind of charm that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen here. But that all changed the day my family moved into the old Foster place. The house was an old Victorian-style manor, sitting on the edge of town. It had been empty for years, but I'd always heard whispers about it. The kind of stories you'd hear about any house that had been around for over 100 years. The previous owners had left abruptly, and no one really knew why. The house had just sat there, falling apart, until my parents decided to buy it and fix it up. I wasn't thrilled about the move. I had friends back in the city, and this house, this strange, sprawling house, didn't seem like home. Still, I was too young to argue, so I packed my things and left my old life behind. At first, everything seemed fine. My parents busied themselves with the renovation work, and I spent my days wandering the town trying to find a way to fit in. But there was something unsettling about the house. The long, dark hallways. The way the floors creaked at night, even when no one was walking. My room was on the second floor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows, just out of sight. It was my mother who first mentioned the odd noises. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but soon she started hearing things too. Soft whispers, scratching sounds from the walls, and there was always a cold spot in the hallway just outside my room. No matter how many times she checked, the heating and cooling system couldn't seem to fix it. It wasn't long before I started noticing the strange occurrences myself. I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone had just passed my door. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps walking through the house when no one was awake. And the worst part? There were times when I could swear I wasn't alone. There was something there with me in my room, just out of sight, just out of reach. But when I'd turn on the lights or call out, there was nothing there. One night I decided to confront it. I'd had enough of the whispers and the strange coldness that filled the house, so I took a flashlight and went down to the basement. The basement had always felt off, like it was a place where things were better left undisturbed. My parents had warned me not to go down there, but that night, something in me snapped. I needed to know what was going on. The stairs creaked as I descended into the darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The air smelled damp, like old wood and mildew. As I moved deeper, I felt a pressure in the air, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of the house settling above me. I reached the bottom and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a door. It was small, almost hidden by piles of old boxes and furniture, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door was old, the wood warped with age, but what caught my eye were the symbols carved into it. Strange, jagged markings like nothing I had ever seen before. I felt a chill run down my spine. Without thinking, I walked toward it. My hand reached for the doorknob, cold and smooth under my fingers. I hesitated for just a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. Beyond it was a narrow stone staircase leading even further underground. The air was thick with an odd, metallic scent, and the darkness below seemed to draw me in, like a force I couldn't resist. Something in me told me I shouldn't go down there. Something told me to turn back and forget what I had just found. But it was too late. I took the first step, and that's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I descended further, the voices grew louder, more urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something primal about them, something dark and ancient. I could feel my pulse quicken as I took another step, my feet heavy, as though the weight of whatever was down there was pulling me closer. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small chamber. The air was colder than ever, and the stone walls seemed to close in around me. In the center of the room was a large, flat stone covered in more of those strange symbols. The floor was littered with old, tattered books, their pages yellowed and fragile. There was an altar of some kind, made of stone, and scattered around it were objects I couldn't make sense of. Bones, shards of broken glass, and pieces of fabric that looked like they had been torn off something or someone. I was frozen in place, staring at the scene before me when I felt it. A cold hand brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. I turned back to the altar, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner, hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, almost skeletal, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was standing completely still, its thin, bony hand raised as if reaching for me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The whispering was deafening now, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, urging me forward, urging me to come closer. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Before I could move, the figure stepped forward, its feet making no sound against the cold stone floor. The light in its eyes grew brighter, and the air around me grew colder. "Leave," a voice whispered, but it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran up the stairs, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't look back until I had slammed the basement door shut behind me. When I emerged from the basement, my parents were waiting in the living room, looking at me like they had been expecting me. "Sam, we've been waiting for you," my mother said softly. I blinked, disoriented. "What do you mean?" My father walked toward me, his face grave. "It's time to leave, son. We can't stay here any longer." I stared at them, confused. What are you talking about? My mother sighed and sat down, her voice barely a whisper. You're not the first to have gone down there. There's something in that basement, something we should never have brought with us. House is cursed, Sam. It always has been. I wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. The memory of what I had seen in the basement, the figure, the voices still haunted me. We never spoke of it again. The house was sold shortly after. The new owners seemed nice, and they didn't know about what had happened, about the things we had found. But as we drove away, I looked back at the Foster place one last time. The house was silent, its dark windows staring back at me, and in that silence I could almost hear the whispering. It's still there, waiting.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. Not until the day the town found the bunker. It was an ordinary Thursday, and I was just another small-town guy going about my business. My name is Jack Turner, and I've lived my whole life in a place called Ridgefield, a town that seemed like it had been stuck in time. The streets were lined with old, weathered buildings, and there was a small park where kids still played kickball, and the library smelled of old books. Nothing ever happened here. It was a peaceful place, the kind where nothing ever felt out of place and no one would dare suspect anything sinister was lurking beneath the surface. That all changed when they found the bunker. It wasn't even a big deal at first. Some of the local farmers had been doing some land clearing on the outskirts of town, removing some brush and rocks. They hadn't expected to find anything remarkable. But that's when they unearthed it. Something buried deep under the ground. Something metal, something that shouldn't have been there. The sheriff, Ben Hawkins, was the first to see it. I was working at the local mechanic shop when I got the call. Ben asked me to come out and take a look since he knew I had a knack for fixing old equipment. It sounded like nothing to worry about, just a forgotten relic. I figured I'd grab my tools and head out to help. When I arrived, I could see the excitement in Ben's eyes. He was standing at the edge of a trench, with a few other townsfolk gathered around. The earth had been pulled back, revealing a rusted steel door. It wasn't the kind of door you'd expect to find in a place like Ridgefield, more like something from an old military base or underground facility. "We found it buried out here, Jack," Ben said, his voice low, almost reverent. "What do you think?" I crouched down beside the trench, eyeing the door. It was old but solid, with strange, faded symbols engraved into its surface. A feeling of unease settled over me. But I was a practical man, and I told myself if it was just an old storage facility, maybe something from the days of the war. Nothing to be afraid of. "Could be an old fallout shelter," I muttered, though I didn't believe it for a second. The thing didn't look like any fallout shelter I'd ever seen. Ben and the others gathered around while I examined the hinges. They were rusted, but not beyond repair. With a little elbow grease, I was able to pry the door open. As it creaked, a chill seeped out from within, something unnatural that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Inside, there was nothing like I expected. The room was large and circular, its walls covered in some sort of reinforced steel, with strange, almost alien-looking markings carved into the surface. There were strange machines in there, too, machines I couldn't recognize, machines that looked more like they belonged to some high-tech laboratory than a rural town like ours. But it was what was in the center of the room that got me. At first, I thought it was some sort of statue, a piece of forgotten art. But as I stepped closer, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a statue at all. It was a body that hadn't decayed. I took a step back, my mind racing. It was a human body, but it was different. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its features were strangely distorted, as if it had been subjected to some kind of unnatural force. It wasn't a person anymore, at least not in any way I could understand. It was something else. "Ben," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What the hell is this?" Ben didn't answer me right away. He was staring at the body with wide eyes, and then, to my horror, he stepped forward. "You don't get it, Jack," he said, his voice distant, almost hollow. "This is what's been here all along. This is why the town's been so quiet, why nothing ever happens here." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but then he spoke again. "This thing, it's been here for years, and we've been too blind to see it." That's when the ground trembled beneath our feet. It was subtle at first, just a vibration, but then it grew stronger, shaking the walls and making the ceiling groan. We all froze, staring around us in panic. The machines in the room hummed to life, their lights flickering on, casting eerie shadows across the steel walls. And then the body moved. It wasn't much at first, just a twitch of the fingers, but it was enough. It was enough to make my stomach turn. I backed away quickly, but the others were frozen, watching in silent terror. The body jerked again, its chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. But it wasn't breathing like a normal person. It was like a machine, a mechanism that had been turned on after a long period of inactivity. And then its eyes opened. They were hollow, dark pools, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in them. A glimmer of recognition, a sense of awareness. It was looking at me, or at least looking through me, with eyes that seemed to know more than I did, more than I could ever understand. Suddenly it sat up, and in the dead silence its voice, gravely, low, and almost mechanical, spoke. "Help me." I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The thing in front of me was like a ghost, but not in the way I had ever imagined. It wasn't a spirit from the past, a lingering soul. It was something different, something darker. Ben took a step forward. He was still staring at the creature, but I saw something change in his eyes. It wasn't fear anymore, it was something else, something I couldn't place. A strange reverence. "Help me," the thing repeated, its voice growing weaker. I don't know what happened next. There was a noise like the whirring of machinery, and then I heard a crack, sharp and sudden, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I turned to find that Ben had collapsed, his face twisted in pain. The creature's eyes were fixed on him now, and there was a sound, almost like a low guttural hum, coming from it. I rushed to Ben's side, but before I could reach him, the creature lurched forward, its hand outstretched. "Help me." I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember how we got out of that bunker. I don't remember how we managed to close the door behind us. But when we made it back to the surface, I knew something had changed. The town was different. It was as if the very air had thickened, as if everything was holding its breath. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, people have started to disappear. It's subtle at first, just a few people, a handful of faces we don't see anymore, but it's happening. And every time I pass by Ben's house, I can see him standing in the window, his eyes hollow and empty, just like the thing in the bunker. The town isn't the same anymore. Ridgefield has changed, and I don't know what's coming next, but I can feel it. Something is waking up, something we weren't meant to uncover, and I'm not sure we'll survive whatever it is.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, not before that day, not before the town found the bunker. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. The town was nestled in the hills, surrounded by thick forests, quiet roads, and old houses that had seen better days. Nothing ever happened here. No drama, no crime, no mysteries. That's the way we liked it. But everything changed one afternoon in late fall, when a group of construction workers stumbled upon something they shouldn't have, something that would unravel everything. It was supposed to be a routine excavation. They were digging a new access road, trying to improve the infrastructure for the town. But about 3 miles from the edge of town, right by the old coal mine that had been shut down decades ago, the workers hit something strange, something solid and unnatural, deep beneath the earth. It wasn't a rock, it was metal. At first they thought it was an old mine shaft, but when they dug deeper, they realized it wasn't a shaft at all. It was a door, an old rusted steel door embedded into the ground, nearly hidden under layers of dirt and stone. The workers were cautious at first, but curiosity got the best of them. They pried it open with crowbars, and what they found underneath was like something out of a horror movie. A bunker. No one in town had ever heard of it before. There was no record of it. It wasn't on any maps. There was no indication that anyone had ever even used it. When the town's sheriff, a man named Ben Hawkins, got word of the discovery, he brought a few deputies out to investigate. The thing that struck me and everyone else was the smell. It wasn't just the stale, musty scent of something long forgotten. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, something that shouldn't have been there after all these years. I was there that afternoon. I had been friends with Ben since we were kids, so when he called to let me know what they'd found, I didn't hesitate. I joined him and a few others as we walked down into the bunker, our flashlights cutting through the dark. The moment we crossed the threshold of the bunker, I felt it, an unnatural chill in the air. It wasn't cold in the usual sense. It was as if the temperature itself had been twisted, something off about the very atmosphere. But I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on what lay ahead. The inside of the bunker was cavernous, far bigger than it had any right to be for something that looked like it had been abandoned for so long. The walls were covered with dust, cobwebs, and old, yellowed papers. There were metal tables lined up along the walls, strange equipment I'd never seen before, and in the center of the room, a massive steel box with a lock that looked too complicated for anything we had seen before. The worst part was the markings. On the walls, on the floors, even on the equipment, scratches, symbols, and phrases. Some of them were in English, but most were unrecognizable, like they came from some ancient language, a language that shouldn't have existed. It was clear that whoever had built this place, whoever had lived here, had been preparing for something dark. But what really made my skin crawl was what we found at the far end of the room. There was a glass chamber, large enough to fit a person, and inside it, something or someone. It looked like a person, but not quite. Their body was contorted, stretched in ways that seemed unnatural, and their face was covered with some sort of mask, a mask with dark, hollow eyes. I couldn't breathe when I saw it. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human anymore. It was something else. Sheriff Hawkins seemed unfazed at first, but then his face went pale. He stepped closer to the glass and reached out as if to touch it, but something stopped him. I could see his hand tremble as he pulled back. I stepped up beside him, my flashlight flickering nervously as I examined the figure inside the glass. That's when I saw it. Something etched on the glass, a symbol that matched the ones on the walls. It was as if the figure had been trapped in the chamber, suspended in some kind of eerie stasis. "Ben," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What the hell is that?" He didn't answer me right away. He just stood there, staring at the glass, his face grim. Finally, he said, "I don't know, but whatever it is, it was meant to stay hidden, and we just uncovered it. We spent hours down there, searching for answers. But the more we looked, the more we realized we weren't meant to understand." Everything in that bunker seemed to have been placed there deliberately, as if someone had been preparing for something, or perhaps hiding from something. By the time we left the bunker and returned to town, the unease had settled in deep. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had done something irreversible. We'd disturbed something ancient, something that wasn't supposed to be uncovered. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Whatever was in that bunker, whatever we had unleashed, was now free. The next few days were strange. People in town started acting differently. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. People would avoid eye contact, whispering when they thought no one was listening. The air itself felt thicker, heavier. It wasn't just the weather either. There was something in the town, something that had changed since we opened that door. And then came the dreams. It started with me. At least, that's what I thought at first. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something had been standing at the edge of my bed. The dreams were always the same. Dark corridors, symbols, and the figure from the bunker, its hollow eyes staring into mine, pleading for something, or maybe warning me. And no matter how many times I tried to wake up, the dreams felt real, so real that I wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Then it spread. People in town started talking about the same dreams, the same dark figure. It wasn't just me. And they weren't just dreams. People started seeing things. Shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, strange noises late at night. The stench of decay that lingered in the air, even though the town was far from any source of real rot. It was as if the bunker had somehow infected the town, like it had opened a door to something far worse than any of us could have imagined. We had uncovered something in that bunker, something not meant for the world. And now it was free. And it wasn't going to stop until it had everything it came for. And I knew, deep down, that it was coming for me next.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a break from the monotony of my life in the city. I had heard about a small town upstate called Briarwood. It was the kind of place that tourists never visited, a forgotten part of the map where nothing ever happened. That's exactly why I was drawn to it. I needed peace, a retreat from my hectic work life, and Briarwood seemed like the perfect spot. Little did I know, I would leave with more than just memories. I would leave with a terror that would haunt me forever. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The air was crisp and the roads were winding, cutting through dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. There was a quiet stillness to the place, a sort of heaviness that I couldn't place, but I shrugged it off. The town itself was tiny, barely a couple dozen houses scattered along the main road, a small diner and a general store. It looked like a place frozen in time, untouched by modern development. I checked into a bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Marjorie. She was kind, though a little too eager to give me the best room, the one in the back that had a strange smell to it. When I asked her about the rest of the town, she just smiled and said, "Not much happens here, but it's peaceful." She made me promise to enjoy my stay and reminded me to be back before dark. I didn't think much of it. After a quick dinner at the diner, I decided to take a walk around the town. It was peaceful, as she had said, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. As I wandered, I noticed a peculiar sign at the edge of town. It was old, faded, and hanging crookedly from a rusted post. The sign simply read, "Do not enter." Beneath it, there was a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. I thought it was strange, especially for such a small town. Who would put up a sign like that here? Curiosity got the best of me, so I followed the path. The woods quickly swallowed the remaining light, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant animal sounds. The path twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step. I felt uneasy, but I kept going, unsure of what exactly I was looking for. My foot hit something hard, and I stumbled, my hand reaching out to steady myself. When I looked down, I saw it. It was an old wooden door, half buried in the earth, covered in vines and moss. I knelt down and cleared away some of the debris, revealing the full extent of the door. It looked ancient, like something from another era. The hinges were rusted and the wood was warped. But there was a strange mark on it, a symbol carved into the wood that I didn't recognize. It wasn't anything like the town's usual rustic charm. This was something different. My heart raced. A part of me wanted to turn back, but another part, something dark and primal, urged me to open it. I pulled on the handle. It creaked loudly, sending a shiver down my spine. The door opened just enough for me to squeeze through, and I stepped into the darkness beyond. The air was thick with dampness, and I could smell the must of old stone and earth. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the room. It was a small chamber, stone walls covered in more symbols, some of which looked like they had been carved into the rock itself. There was a strange, pulsating energy in the room, as if something was alive within the walls. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen force. In the center of the room, there was an altar. It was made of rough stone, and atop it lay a small, ornate box. The box looked out of place, as if it didn't belong there. It was intricately carved, with strange markings that mirrored those on the walls. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about it pulled me closer, as if it was calling me. I approached cautiously and reached out to touch the box. The moment my fingers brushed against it, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room. The ground beneath me trembled, and the walls seemed to close in. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and I could hear something moving in the shadows. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. There was no way out. I was trapped. I fumbled with my phone, trying to find a way to open the door, but my hands were shaking too badly. The growling grew louder, and I could hear something breathing, something large, something not human. Then the box on the altar began to move. It was slow at first, as if whatever was inside was awakening from a long slumber. The box shifted, scraping across the stone. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to know what was inside, but I couldn't look away. The growling turned into a low, rumbling laugh, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching toward me. I ran. I don't remember much after that. I remember the door opening, without me touching it, and I remember running back down the path through the woods, my heart thudding in my chest. I remember stumbling, tripping, and falling several times, but I kept going. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the road leading back into town. I didn't stop until I reached the bed and breakfast, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I stayed in my room that night, locking the door and closing the windows. The feeling that something was watching me never left. In the middle of the night, I heard it. The low growl. It echoed through the woods, distant but unmistakable. Something was still out there. Something had followed me. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I couldn't get out of Briarwood fast enough. I don't know why I never told anyone about the door or the box, but I couldn't bring myself to. The people in the town were friendly, but there was something about them, something hidden behind their eyes, that made me feel like an outsider. When I checked out, Marjorie gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you enjoyed your stay," she said. "Briarwood is a very special place." I left without another word. Now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that room, whatever was in that box, is still out there. I hear it sometimes. Low growls in the dark, whispers that send chills down my spine. I don't know if it's real or if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I know one thing for sure. Briarwood wasn't just a small town. It was a place where things were kept hidden, things that shouldn't be disturbed, and I made the mistake of disturbing them.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. At least, that's what I told myself before I moved to Maple Hollow. Maple Hollow is the kind of town that's never been in a hurry. People talk slow, the streets are narrow, and the houses are old, dating back to the early 1800s. It wasn't anything special, just another small town tucked away from the chaos of city life. When I was offered a job at the local history museum, I jumped at the chance. It was a fresh start. New place, new people, a way to escape my past. The museum was a large, dilapidated building on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like a place you'd walk past without a second thought. But on the inside, it was full of old artifacts, antiques, and documents that painted the history of the town and its people. Most of it was unremarkable, really, until I found the locked room. It was late one evening after most of the other staff had left for the night that I stumbled upon it. I was cleaning up the back storage room when I noticed a door I'd never seen before, tucked away behind some boxes. It wasn't locked, but the handle was old and stiff, and the hinges creaked loudly as I opened it. Inside, the room was dark, filled with an eerie stillness. It smelled musty, as if no one had entered in years. As my eyes adjusted the dim light, I saw that the walls were lined with shelves full of old photographs, furniture, and strange-looking objects. But what caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror resting against the far wall. It was covered in dust, but I could tell it was once beautiful. The frame was intricately carved with delicate designs, almost like vines twisting around the edges, and it was unlike anything else I had seen in the museum. I reached out to touch it. As soon as my fingers brushed the glass, the temperature in the room dropped. It was subtle at first, just a chill in the air, but soon the cold became unbearable. I stepped back, but before I could think of leaving, the mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that filled the space. My heart raced as the humming grew louder, almost deafening. Then, the glass shifted. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the old mirror had become warped with age. But as I stared at my reflection, I saw something else behind me. A figure. Faint at first, just a shadow in the glass, but it grew clearer, taller, darker, and then it spoke. "Leave this place." I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The voice was cold, hollow, like it came from a deep well. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. I couldn't explain it. The voice. The reflection. It was impossible. I stepped away from the mirror, thinking maybe I was just tired, maybe it was the stress of the new job. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its hollow eyes, its shadowy form, lurking in the mirror. The next day, I returned to work with a heavy sense of dread hanging over me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a weight. I avoided the back storage room, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. Then, 2 days later, I found something that changed everything. I was in the museum's archives, going through some old town records, when I came across a dusty journal. It was leather-bound, old, and falling apart. Inside, I found the story of a man named Edward Tillingham. He had been the town's first mayor in the late 1800s, and his family had owned the land that the museum now stood on. According to the journal, Edward had been obsessed with the supernatural. He believed that the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and he had spent years researching ways to communicate with the spirits of the afterlife. Edward had been particularly interested in mirrors, claiming they were portals to another world. According to his journal, he had acquired a rare ancient mirror from an unknown source. The mirror was said to be cursed, a conduit between the living and the dead. The more I read, the more I realized that the mirror in the locked room was the same one described in the journal. Edward's obsession with the mirror had driven him to madness. He had locked himself in his study for days, staring into the mirror, convinced he could speak with the spirits trapped within. But one day, he was found dead, his body cold and lifeless, his eyes wide open in terror. The mirror was said to have been cursed, trapping the souls of those who dared to look into it. It was later locked away in the museum where it had remained for over a century. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The mirror. It was real. And it wasn't just a piece of glass. It was something far darker. A portal to another world. A place where something ancient and malevolent waited. That night, I decided I had to confront it. I went back to the museum, alone, determined to understand what was happening. The air in the building was thick with tension, like something was watching me. I found the locked room and opened the door. The mirror was still there, but this time it was different. It seemed to shimmer, almost as if it was alive. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it again. But this time, I wasn't just looking into the glass. Something was looking back at me. The figure appeared again, but it was more solid now, its form growing clearer by the second. It was tall, with hollow eyes, its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped by its gaze. "Why did you come?" the figure asked, its voice cold and mocking. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, drawn into the depths of the mirror. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging at my soul. My heart raced, my chest tightened. I reached out, desperate to break free, but the figure's hand shot out from the glass, gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered. "Now you belong to us." And just like that, I was gone. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. I don't know if I'm still alive or if I've crossed over to the other side. All I know is that I am here in the mirror, watching as others come and go. Some of them are like me, trapped, unable to escape. Others are still alive, unaware of what lies beyond the glass. I can still hear the voice sometimes, faintly, urging me to reach out, to take someone else. I know it's only a matter of time before someone else comes along, curious, drawn to the sound to the same cursed mirror that claimed me. And when they do, I'll be waiting.